Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to have a little fun today and take a look back at Season 1 for Rings of Power. During the last several months before its release, we had any number of leaks, twists and turns, and of course, YouTube speculation. So let's look back at what we thought or even dared hope what the show might be versus what it actually was. One of the earliest impressions of what we thought the show might become was when we learned that Galadriel was going to be the primary protagonist. Overall, this news came with a positive reaction and for some very good reasons. First, Galadriel is one of the few relevant beings that existed throughout the entirety of the Second Age. This meant that no matter what story Amazon was trying to tell, and regardless of how badly they would have to manipulate the pre-existing timeline to do it, they could always reference back to Galadriel as a point of consistency. Secondly, the Peter Jackson films made Galadriel a fan favorite even amongst the more casual fans. This broader fan base was exactly the core audience Amazon was going to need to make the show successful, and the films unquestionably left that audience wanting more. Finally, we know Amazon has requirements regarding female representation. We don't know the exact specifics of those requirements because Amazon doesn't make them public, but thanks to some leaked information, we know those requirements exist. Regardless of what those specifics actually are, having a female lead would almost certainly help meet those requirements and, ostensibly, would help the creative staff tell ancillary stories in the fashion that they wanted to without having to deal with those constraints. It's unfortunate that this type of political interference is restricting artistic expression. However, on the balance sheet, it's another big point in Galadriel's favor for being the main character. Taking all of this into consideration, as well as a million other things, it's hard to imagine a better centerpiece for the show than Galadriel, and fans had every reason to be excited. Unfortunately, that excitement was short-lived as we found out shortly thereafter that Galadriel was being diminished to a sword-wielding foot soldier, and as it turned out, an unlikable one at that. Again, you have to wonder if Amazon's politics played a part in their decision to abandon the source material in order to better promote certain narratives. Although it's true that in her earlier years, Galadriel was not the same as the Galadriel we saw in the Peter Jackson films, what she actually was ambitious, self-seeking, and determined to carve out her own legacy and to somewhat make a name for herself. What she wasn't and what they gave us was petulant, foolish, and a swordsman with a kung fu grip. Don't get me wrong, there are any number of great female warrior leads, from the action-adventure Selene of the Underworld franchise to the more profound Katniss Everdeen of Hunger Games, or even the fun, cheesy Xena warrior lesbian. But what those ladies have, in fact all great characters have, is they fit in the world for which they were created. Combined with what just amounts to bad writing, the Galadriel character is such a departure from what the fans had every right to expect that the character simply pulls you out of Tolkien's world, which is why we're all there in the first place. As long as the Rings of Power centerpiece character continues to distance us from the Middle-earth that we love, and is relatively unlikable to boot, it's hard to imagine any way that this show could ever resonate with the fans. Let's move on to something a little more positive this time and talk about dwarves. If I recall, we had our first solid confirmation about the dwarves when the official synopsis was released and it spoke about Moria. In one of my earliest videos speculating about the dwarves, I mentioned how during the Second Era this was a time of strife for them and how they really had to prove their mettle. The end of the War of Wrath resulted in a deadly combination of both displaced dwarfs and the defeated remnants of orc armies wandering roughly the same lands at the same time. The resulting conflicts were all but inevitable. Given the show's enormous budget, I'm sure there were plenty of us that was hoping that these battles would be at the heart of the Dwarven storyline. I mean, what could be better than an epic battle that has the production values to match? Although I am still disappointed the series decided to go in another direction, I also have to admit that the presentation of the dwarves was actually quite good. They avoided the trap of making the dwarves little more than comic relief, and Moria was even more impressive than we really had any right to hope. There were also some nice nods to Dwarven culture. In fact, I hope we get more in the future. But most importantly is the dwarves just felt right, which is no small accomplishment when following in the footsteps of Peter Jackson. I know a lot of people will take issue with two Durins being alive at the same time, and justifiably so. However, this is one of the adaptation changes that I actually understand and I've learned to live with. As we move on from the dwarves, this seems a good place as any to talk about the Harfoots. There's been a lot of debate as to why Amazon would use the term Harfoot instead of Hobbit, particularly in light of the fact that one of the justifications for the hobbits in the show was as a marketing bridge between Rings of Power and other Lord of the Rings content. Some argue they used the term Harfoot because the term Hobbit was not used in a contextually relevant fashion in the appendices, and therefore Amazon does not have the rights to the term. Others argue they chose the term Harfoot because at this point in the timeline, the term Hobbit had not been invented yet. Either way you go, that discussion in and of itself highlights just how out of place the Hobbits or Harfoots are in the Second Age. In fact, we can go straight back to the source itself. If we look at his writings and letters, Tolkien himself considered whether or not to add the hobbits into the Second Age, and in my opinion, expressly chose not to. Add in all of the wildly inaccurate information actor Lenny Henry had about the Harfoots and indigenous peoples and the founding of the Shire, I was rather skeptical of the inclusion of the Harfoots in the series. After viewing the first season, I'm still of the same opinion. In fact, I believe it now more than ever. With such a vast timeline already so compacted and so little screen time to tell the story, every minute the Harfoots are on the screen, it's just a waste of resources that could have been better used elsewhere. Like so much of the show, the Harfoots were poorly written and wildly inconsistent in their values and motivations. I do understand what Amazon was trying to do. The inclusion of the Harfoots makes the show appear more approachable, maybe more family-friendly, and appealing to a wider audience. But as is often the case, the wider the audience you solicit, the more diluted your story becomes. There was also some pre-release controversy in regards to the hobbits and race swapping, and I'm going to cover that in just a minute. Speaking of diluted stories and controversy, that brings us to Dr. Tom Shippey and the involvement of the Tolkien estate. When the series was first announced, there was a lot of excitement in the fanbase. However, as time passed and more information became available, some of that enthusiasm turned into skepticism and maybe even a little overblown hysteria. This would appear to be the natural order of things regarding such adaptations. People forget that even Peter Jackson had to suffer through many of these same criticisms until people saw his movies and just how good they really were. For better or worse, Amazon's policy of extreme secrecy regarding the show allowed these criticisms to run unchecked. That was until a promotional video was released which included Dr. Tom Shippey. For those that don't know, Dr. Shippey has been a highly regarded member of the Tolkien community for a long time, has the respect of the fan base as a purist, someone who respects the original source material, and even worked with Peter Jackson on the Lord of the Ring trilogies. The implication of Mr. Shippey's presence in the video was that if Amazon was actually listening to him, they would naturally be guided to a more pure interpretation of the source material. Later, in an interview with a German fan site, Mr. Shippey indicated that the Tolkien estate would have total veto power over the production. Thus, fan hopes were buoyed because they knew people they perceived to have a profound respect for the original material were helping guide the series. Unfortunately, as time passed, we found out those influences were not going to be as profound as we may have hoped. Ironically, it appears that very same interview was a violation of Dr. Shippey's non-disclosure agreement, and shortly thereafter he was dismissed from the show. I say appears because some of the elements regarding that have not been confirmed. The only thing we know for sure is that Mr. Shippey is no longer involved with the production. On top of that, Tolkien's son Christopher has passed away and had previously left control of the Tolkien estate to other people. Christopher was perceived by fans to be the last strong voice for a more pure interpretation of the original work, so much so that he didn't even like the Peter Jackson adaptations. With Christopher Tolkien and Dr. Shippey now gone, whatever guiding light they may have provided to keep Amazon on track was now gone with them. Long story short, what once was something that would serve to reassure the fans was now something that they could count among their biggest concerns. We will likely never know how much influence either man had on the show, if any, or how much of what we eventually saw was something that they actually approved of. And with that, we finally get to the last perception versus reality. Was it woke? When Amazon finally got around to doing some actual marketing for the show, the unfortunate viewer couldn't help but be bombarded by all the usual buzzwords: representation, diversity, equity. Nothing wrong with any of these things, of course, but when they are an inescapable focus behind your marketing campaign, it begs the question, how much priority did you put into that versus other things like storytelling and character development? Ironically, that narrative-driven mindset had its biggest negative impact in what little character development there was. As the series wore on, every new scene with Galadriel, you could feel the writers asking themselves, what would a man do in this situation, instead of asking what would Galadriel do in this situation? This process is at the core of why this version of Galadriel is so alien to the one we know and love. It's very difficult to write a compelling story when you're overly concerned about what message am I sending to what group of people with each word that I pen, as opposed to worrying about the story itself. Unfortunately, this mindset didn't just infect Galadriel, she was just the most egregious example. As far as diversity and inclusion goes, it's clear that when Rings of Power used those words, what they really meant was tokenism. I remember well before the show originally released, I made a video talking about actual diversity. I didn't want Númenórean or Dwarven culture to become a pawn in this game. Tolkien spent his life crafting those, and his work needed to be respected. Fortunately, I thought Amazon did a good job with both, and they deserve credit for that. But Harad is a different story. If you don't know, Harad is an eastern portion of Middle-earth in the general area where the Southland village is, and the people that live there are called the Haradrim. Now, that area and their culture isn't nearly as detailed or fleshed out in the original works. Better yet, we know that Tolkien used African influences in what little he did say about the Haradrim culture. What a fantastic opportunity to use the Southland village in the show for real cultural diversity. Give me people who didn't necessarily look like Númenóreans, different clothes, different armor, different architecture, different interpersonal norms. The people of Harad were more dependent upon horses than the Númenóreans. Wouldn't that have changed things? Did they even use the same style of horse? Rings of Power could have explored all of these avenues and more, and ironically kept it more book accurate while actually offering real diversity. But that takes time, effort, and sincerity. But why do all that when you can just give us generic medieval European village number 5, sprinkle in a few people of color, and say, hey, look at me, I checked a box. As I said, tokenism. By the way, I want to make it very clear, in regards to representation, I'm not criticizing any of the actors involved in the show. Yes, some of them exacerbated the situation by drinking too much of the Kool-Aid on their media tour, but at the end of the day, this is a hard, cutthroat business, and if you have the opportunity to get a good job, you take it. Instead, this criticism is aimed directly at the powers that be behind the show and this narrative-driven mindset. Well, everybody, that's it for me this week. As always, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.